I was waist-deep in red volcanic Jory soil, physically fighting to save my vines from an ice storm, when a $300 champagne cork hit me in the shoulder. I looked up, wiping rain and volcanic soil from my eyes, to see my sister, Madison, standing on my terrace. She was wearing a white gown, laughing with her fiancé's billionaire parents, completely dry and warm. She pointed down at me and said, loud enough for the wind to carry, "Don't worry about the gardener. She's just a hired hand we keep around out of pity." She didn't realize that the hired hand she just insulted owns the deed to the entire estate. She also didn't know I was supposed to be in Europe right now, but I came home early. She thought she had pulled off the perfect crime. I was about to turn her dream engagement party into a crime scene investigation. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't scream. Screaming is for people who need to be heard. I needed to be effective. I stepped back into the shadow of the tree line, letting the rain wash the red clay down the front of my coveralls. To the guests on that terrace, I was a dirty blemish on a perfect afternoon. To the bank, the state of Oregon, and the international wine community, I was Hannah, the 32-year-old master vintner and sole owner of this estate. I wasn't the help. I was the landlord. But my family had a talent for rewriting reality. My parents, Stephen and Susan, were masters of the edit. In their version of the world, my soil science degree was a gardening hobby. My ownership of the estate was a family administrative detail. And Madison? Madison was the star. I watched from the darkness as Madison laughed, throwing her head back in that practiced way she did for cameras. She was 25, beautiful, and completely hollow. For years, I had accepted my role as the ghost of the estate. I managed the books, I cured the vines, I negotiated the distribution deals. I was the utility essential but invisible, like the plumbing or the Wi-Fi. You only notice the utility when it stops working. Madison, on the other hand, was the golden child. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a pathological system. In sociology, they call it the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. The golden child isn't loved for who they are worshipped as a projection of the parents' vanity. Madison was shiny, loud, and aesthetic, everything Stephen and Susan desperately wanted to be. I was the scapegoat. Or maybe just the vessel for their shame. I was the one who worked with dirt. I was the one who talked about soil pH and fermentation yields, boring details that didn't look good on a Christmas card, so they erased me. They didn't just ignore my success, they actively transferred it to Madison. I remembered last Thanksgiving. I had just won a double gold medal for my Blanc de Noirs. When I tried to tell them, my mother cut me off to announce that Madison had reached 10,000 followers. She told me that was nice, but they needed to focus on news everyone could understand. They treated my life like a missing stair in a staircase, a dangerous gap everyone knew was there but silently agreed to step over. I was the one who always rushed in with a plank of wood to patch it up, to keep the family from falling. I paid the bills they forgot. I fixed the messes Madison made. I kept the illusion stable. But standing there in the freezing rain, watching them drink my inventory, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap, it was the quiet, final click of a lock engaging. I wasn't going to be the utility anymore. The power was about to go out. I turned away from the terrace and headed for the service entrance. I didn't wipe my boots. I didn't try to make myself presentable. I wanted to stay dirty. I wanted the contrast. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went before I cut it out. I swiped my keycard at the heavy steel door of the basement security wing. The lock beeped green, a sharp, artificial sound that cut through the humidity of the storm. I stepped inside, leaving the smell of rain and wet earth behind for the sterile hum of servers and air conditioning. Frank was already standing at the console. He was 60, built like a retired linebacker, and had been my head of security for 5 years. He looked at me covered in red mud, hair matted against my forehead, and then at the monitors. He asked me why I looked like I had just crawled out of a landslide, and why there was a party happening upstairs if I was supposed to be in France. I walked over to the bank of screens. I asked him why there was a wedding reception happening in my tasting room. He stiffened and told me it wasn't a wedding reception, but an engagement party. And he authorized it, because I told him to. I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the rain. I asked him to show me the authorization. He pulled up an email on the main screen. I leaned in, dripping clay water onto the linoleum. The sender was listed as Hannah, the caretaker. My real email address was Hannah, the vintner. I read the text. It authorized the use of the venue as a gift for my sister, and claimed I would be off-grid in Bordeaux. Hannah the caretaker. The words tasted like ash. She didn't just steal the venue. She demoted me to staff in my own company directory. Frank realized it was a fake address. He realized she had spoofed the domain. I told him it was wire fraud and identity theft. Frank reached for his radio, ready to clear the room in 10 minutes. I told him, no. I pulled up a chair and sat down. The mud on my legs was starting to dry, tightening against my skin like a second layer of armor. If he shut it down now, it would be a family squabble. It would be a misunderstanding. She would cry, she would say she mixed up the emails, and my parents would pay the cleaning fee. I looked at the monitors. High-definition feeds of my life being consumed by strangers. I wanted to see how expensive this mistake got. For the next hour, the security room became a war room. We watched in silence as the bill racked up. I pulled a legal pad from the desk and started an audit. The catering wasn't standard, it was the platinum package. I watched servers bringing out trays of Wagyu sliders and white truffle risotto balls. That was $300 a head. I watched the floral arrangements being adjusted. Those were imported orchids, not local wildflowers. $5,000, easy. Then I saw Madison standing with Cynthia near the panoramic window. Frank turned up the audio gain on that specific camera. I heard Madison telling Cynthia that, ideally, they would pave over the south block. She gestured to my experimental vine's genetically unique stock I'd spent 7 years cultivating. She said the mud was messy, and suggested luxury glamping pods. She wanted to turn the caretaker's shed into a juice bar. I stopped writing. She wasn't just spending my money. She was selling my future. She was pitching the destruction of my life's work to her future mother-in-law as a renovation project. Frank whispered that she actually thought she owned it. I told him she thought I was a placeholder. She thought I was just keeping the seat warm until she decided to take over. I looked down at my ledger. The number was climbing. 70,000, 80,000. It wasn't enough. Frank warned me that they were eating my inventory. I told him to let them. I didn't want a bill they could pay with a credit card and an apology. I want a bill that required a mortgage. I wanted a bill that constituted a felony. I watched the monitor. A waiter was approaching the head table with a tray of crystal flutes. I leaned forward. Frank zoomed in. He told me it was the 1992 reserve. My heart hammered against my ribs. That wasn't wine. That was an artifact. I told him if they opened that, there was no going back. That bottle wasn't just expensive. It was the 1992 Pinot Noir Magnum. It was the first vintage my grandfather ever bottled under his own label. There were 3 left in existence. I promised one to the Smithsonian. Frank's hand hovered over the radio button. He wanted to call a code red. I reached out and covered his hand with mine. My palm left a smear of red clay on his knuckles. I told him to let it happen. He argued that it was a $12,500 bottle of wine. I cut in. If they drank that, it stopped being a family dispute. It became a felony. I watched the screen. Madison was laughing, holding the Magnum by the neck like it was a cheap bottle of Prosecco. She didn't know the history. She didn't know the soil pH levels, or the grafting techniques, or the years of cellar aging required to produce that liquid. To her, it was just a prop. A big, expensive prop for her Instagram story. She thought she was untouchable. She thought that because she was the pretty one, the rules bent around her. She thought that if she got caught, she could just cry and Mom would write a check. I leaned back, crossing my arms over the stiff, muddy canvas of my coveralls. I needed the bill to be so high that Mom couldn't write a check. This was the hardest part. The instinct is always to jump in, to save the thing you love, to scream stop. But I had learned something in my years of being invisible. Silence is a weapon. When you scream, you look crazy. When you wait, you look lethal. The most powerful person in the room isn't the one making the most noise. It's the one holding the receipt. On the monitor, the corkscrew twisted into the foil. I didn't flinch. I treated it like a controlled burn in the vineyard, sacrificing one part to save the whole. If I interrupted them now, Madison would spin it. She'd say she didn't know. She'd say I was being stingy. My parents would back her up, claiming I cared more about old grape juice than my sister's happiness. But grand larceny? You can't gaslight a police report. The sound of the cork popping cracked through the security room speakers, tinny and sharp. Frank winced. I corrected him. They didn't just open it, they just bought it. I watched as Madison poured the dark red liquid into Cynthia's glass, then Tyler's, then her own. They didn't even swirl it. They didn't check the legs or smell the bouquet. They just knocked it back like it was water. I picked up my pen and added $12,500 to the bottom of the ledger. I drew a double line under the total. $168,000. That was the number. Frank looked at the notepad, then at me. He looked terrified. Not of the intruders, but of me. He asked if I was really going to do this. I stood up. The dried mud cracked and fell from my shoulders like old skin. I felt lighter. The anxiety was gone. The guilt was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard math of the situation. I told him they drank the wine. Now they had to pay the tab. I reached into the pocket of my coveralls and pulled out the wireless credit card terminal. It was small, black, and fully charged. I told Frank to give me 2 minutes, then bring the team. He asked if I wanted them to clear the room. I said no. I wanted them to witness the transaction. I pushed open the double doors to the grand ballroom and stepped into the light. The transition was violent. 1 second, I was in the dim, concrete service corridor. The next, I was surrounded by a world of aggressive perfection. White orchids cascaded from the ceiling. Crystal chandeliers refracted the light into 1,000 rainbows. The air smelled of expensive perfume, peony blossoms, and the distinct, metallic scent of money. And then there was me. I stood in the doorway, a figure carved out of red volcanic clay. The mud had dried into a stiff, cracking shell on my coveralls, but my boots were still wet, dripping a slurry of Jory soil and rainwater onto the polished limestone floor. I didn't look like a person. I looked like the land itself had risen up to take the house back. The string quartet trailed off into a discordant squeak. The hum of 50 conversations died instantly. It wasn't a gradual silence, it was a vacuum. I didn't blink. I didn't wipe my face. I just started walking. My heavy rubber boots hit the floor with a wet, heavy rhythm that echoed off the glass walls. I walked straight down the center aisle, between the tables of terrified guests. I saw their faces, the shock, the revulsion. They looked at me like I was a natural disaster that had breached the perimeter. Good. I reached the pristine white carpet runner that led to the head table. I didn't step around it, I stepped right onto it. Every footfall left a thick, red stamp of ownership. I was marking my territory in the most primal way possible. I was the stain they couldn't scrub out. Madison was sitting at the center of the head table, a flute of my 1992 reserve in her hand. When she saw me, she didn't look guilty, she looked horrified. Not because I was her sister, but because I was ruining the aesthetic. I was a smudge on her perfect white canvas. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She shrieked for security. She yelled that the gardener was drunk and demanded someone get me out of there and call the police. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of her, separated only by the floral arrangement she'd bought with my money. I placed the black credit card terminal on the white tablecloth. It left a smear of red grit. I told her she didn't need to call the police. They were already on the perimeter. She stared at me, her chest heaving. She asked what I was doing, and told me I was ruining everything. She said I was filthy. I told her I wasn't filthy. I was working. Unlike her. I looked around the table. Tyler, the fiancé, looked like he wanted to dissolve into the upholstery. Cynthia, the billionaire mother-in-law, was watching me with narrow, calculating eyes. My parents were paralyzed, their mouths hanging open. I turned back to Madison. I began to list the charges, ticking the points off on my muddy fingers. She sent a fraudulent email from a fake account. That was wire fraud. She entered a property she did not own and hosted an unauthorized commercial event. That was criminal trespass. I pointed to the empty Magnum bottle sitting like a trophy in front of her. And she consumed inventory valued at over $10,000 without payment. That was grand larceny. She whispered that I was crazy. She gripped the edge of the table and insisted this was her family's estate and I couldn't charge her for her own engagement party. I corrected her. It wasn't her family's estate, it was mine. My name was on the deed. My name was on the liquor license. And my name was on the police report I was about to file. I picked up the terminal and held it out to her. $168,000. Pay the bill, or leave in handcuffs. Madison tried to laugh. It was a brittle, frantic sound that cracked against the glass walls. She told the table I was hallucinating from the cleaning chemical fumes. She told them to ignore me. She waved her hand at me, as if I were a fly, and told me to go back to the shed. She said we would discuss my severance tomorrow. I didn't blink. I didn't even look at her. I shifted my gaze past her shoulder to the woman sitting in the high-backed chair. The only person in the room whose opinion actually carried weight. I said her name. Cynthia. The billionaire matriarch narrowed her eyes. She wasn't looking at the mud on my boots anymore. She was looking at my face. She said my name slowly. It wasn't a question. I confirmed it. Cynthia stood up. She ignored Madison, who was tugging at her sleeve. She asked if I was the one who wrote the paper on dry farming in volcanic Jory soils, the one published in the American Journal of Enology last month. I nodded. Page 42. The resilience of stress-inducing rootstocks. She said she had been trying to get a meeting with me for 6 months. She sent 3 inquiries to my estate manager, and was told I was unavailable. She was told I was on sabbatical in Europe. She turned her gaze to my parents. Stephen and Susan shrank back, looking like children caught stealing candy. My father stammered that they just didn't want to bother me because I was very private. Cynthia corrected him. She said they hid me. They hid the most valuable asset on this property because I didn't fit their aesthetic. She looked back at me, at the red clay caked in my hair, at the exhaustion etched into my face. She said I wasn't in Europe. I told her I was in the South Block. Saving the harvest my sister just tried to sell her. I placed the credit card terminal on the table again. $168,000. And $12,500 for the bottle. I told her to pay it. Madison looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at his shoes. She lied, and said she left her wallet in the car. I told her to use the card on file. The one ending in 4022. The emergency card I gave her for gas and groceries. Her face went gray. She knew that card. She also knew I had lowered the limit to $500 3 months ago. I told her to swipe it. With a trembling hand, she pulled the card from her designer clutch. She swiped it. The machine beeped. Declined. The red light on the machine was the only illumination in the room. She whispered for it to try again. I told her it was declined because she was broke. She didn't have money. She had an allowance. And she just spent it all on a party she couldn't afford. My mother hissed at me to stop. She stood up and said I was making a scene and we could work this out as a family. I told her we weren't a family. We were a business arrangement that just went bankrupt. They prioritized the show pony over the workhorse. Now the workhorse was calling in the debt. I looked at Frank standing by the door and told him to call the sheriff. Frank reached for his radio. Cynthia said one word, wait. The single word stopped everything. Cynthia reached into her purse. She didn't look angry. She looked resigned. She pulled out a black anodized titanium card, the kind that invites you to things, not the kind that gets declined. She placed it on the white tablecloth with a heavy metallic clack. She told me to swipe it. Madison let out a sob of relief. She thanked Cynthia and started to say she knew it was just a mix-up. Cynthia snapped at her to be quiet. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. She turned to me. She said she was paying this debt, not for Madison, but because she respected what I built here. And because she refused to have her son's engagement announcement appear in the police blotter. I picked up the black card. It was heavy. I accepted it. I swiped it. Approved. $168,000. I tore off the receipt and handed it to Cynthia. She took it, then turned to Madison. She leaned in close, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard the whisper. She told Madison she wasn't going to jail. But she wasn't free, either. Madison worked for her now. Every penny of this was a loan. She would not buy a latte without permission. She would not post a photo without approval. She was an investment that had gone bad, and Cynthia was going to manage her until she got her return. Madison looked at the woman who had just bought her life. The relief on her face died, replaced by the dawning horror of a different kind of prison. Cynthia turned back to me. She said they were leaving. She asked me to send her a case of the 2018 vintage. She would pay full retail. I told her I would have it sent to her office. The guests filed out in stunned silence. My parents tried to linger, to catch my eye, to offer some weak explanation. I pointed to the door. My father tried to plead with me. I told him he was trespassing. And unlike Madison, nobody was there to bail him out. The harvest came in heavy this year. Small, tight clusters of Pinot Noir. Dark as ink, and heavy with sugar. I stood on the terrace, the same spot where Madison had sipped my stolen wine 6 months ago. The air was different now. It was crisp, smelling of crushed skins, wet earth, and fermentation. The silence was absolute. No string quartet, no clinking glasses, just the wind rattling the dry leaves of the vine rows. I was alone. And for the first time in my life, alone didn't feel like erasure, it felt like peace. My parents had tried to come back, of course. A week after the party, my father showed up at the main gate. He didn't have the code. I watched him on the security monitor, pressing the buzzer, looking small and confused. He shouted that we were family. He shouted that I was being cruel. I didn't answer. I didn't open the gate. I simply turned off the monitor. I had spent 30 years being the plank of wood they used to patch their broken staircase. I finally removed myself, and if they couldn't climb on their own, that wasn't my problem anymore. I pulled my phone from my work vest. I didn't follow Madison. I had blocked her number the night of the party, but Cynthia sent me quarterly updates. It was part of our arrangement. I opened the latest email. It was a photo of Madison and Tyler at a charity gala. On the surface, it was the picture of success. Madison was wearing a vintage Chanel gown, tasteful, conservative, and beige. Her hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, the way Cynthia wore hers. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes looked like a deer caught in headlights, constantly scanning for approval, terrified of making a mistake. The caption, written by Cynthia's PR team, read, "Legacy and Tradition." I looked down at my own hands. They were stained purple from the grape must. My fingernails were short and packed with soil. My boots were caked in mud. My back ached from 18 hours on the sorting line. I was filthy. I was exhausted. I was the woman in the mud. But then I looked back at the photo of my sister in the marble mansion. She was clean. She was draped in diamonds. She was living the life she had begged for. And she was a prisoner. That is the truth about the gilded cage. From the outside, it looks like a palace. It looks like safety. But inside, the air is thin. You don't own the perch you stand on. You don't own the song you sing. You are a pet, kept only as long as you are pleasing. Madison had traded her autonomy for an aesthetic. And now she was realizing that the price of admission was her soul. She was rich, and she was enslaved. I was working class, and I was free. I put the phone away. I poured a glass of the 2018 vintage, the one Cynthia bought by the case, and walked to the edge of the terrace. The sun was setting, turning the valley into a sea of gold and fire. I took a sip. It tasted like blackberries, oak, and cold, hard justice. I chose the mud and the silence. My sister chose the mansion and the chains. Which one would you have chosen? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.